Okay, so we're going to be trimming the bowls that we made last time. And what trimming does is it takes away all of this excess clay that was there to support the curve underneath while you were throwing. You can see that I can easily handle these pieces without them collapsing anymore. That's because they've gotten to a leather hard stage. You need to wait until your bowls are evenly leather hard before you try to trim them. Because if you try to trim them too early, they'll be too wet, they'll collapse. If you try to do them too dry, you won't be able to use the tool properly. It won't bite into the clay like it needs to. Leather hard, as we discussed in class, is when you can pick the clay up and you can kind of move it very minimally. It has a little bit of flexibility to it still, but it's significantly stiffer than it was when it was wet on the wheel. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do when you are getting ready to trim your bowls is to look at the interior contour, because that's what you're going to be mirroring on the outside, okay? What you don't want to do is completely ignore that, flip it over, and start trimming without knowing what that space looks like, because you might go too deep in an area on the outside and go through the vessel, and then you've ruined your bowl. So you really want to understand what that shape looks like. On this bowl, I have this kind of wall, very distinct wall right here. So I want to remember that when I'm trimming the outside. Fortunately, that information is also right here. And I'm going to be trimming mostly this area here, so I don't have to be too concerned. This bowl is much rounder on the inside. Doesn't have that same kind of transition. So again, I want to be sure that I understand that contour, because that's the purpose of trimming, is that you want to mirror the inside contour on the outside while it's flipped over and you can't see the inside, and that's the tricky part. So you have to recenter the vessel on the wheel. Again, think about using your concentric circles. So I put a little bit of water on there, and you want to kind of scoot the bowl around, and this is called tapping on center, where you get the wheel going pretty slow speed. I don't have a really good way of explaining what's happening here other than I'm keeping my left hand on the outside supporting the vessel, the bowl, and using my right hand to tap into the middle. Okay, another way that you can tell is if you're close to being centered. Examine those concentric circles, okay? So I'm not completely equidistant. You can see from this perspective that, you know, it kind of goes in and out a little bit. Well, that could be a couple of things. That could be that my bowl actually is not as perfectly symmetrical up here, and it might actually be centered down here. So I'm looking at, you know, am I centered down where I'm going to actually be applying my tool? So another way, if you're having a hard time, is you can use your pin tool. Okay, so you want to hold your hand nice and steady. See how my arm is anchored on my leg to keep it steady. If your pin tool mark only hits in one spot, that means you're off center. You want to use that information, okay? So wherever that line is, you can use that, because that means you need to push that side closer to center. Once you've got it centered, press it down. You want to press it down in the center. Another thing that you can do to help kind of anchor it in place is to use wads of clay. You want to use soft clay. Remember that the clay that you pull out of the bin can be used by wheel throwers or hand builders, and sometimes that hand building clay, when it gets returned in there, is pretty stiff. If you go and use pretty stiff clay and anchor this down, then you're probably going to end up cracking the vessel and not really realizing it until after it comes out of the bisque. Also notice that I'm holding the pot down as I push that clay down, and I'm not pushing the clay into it. I'm mostly pushing that clay downwards and a little bit towards the vessel, okay? So what we want to do here is we want to use our large trimming tool. We're going to start to take off this edge right here first. Now this clay is a little bit stiffer than what I normally like to trim. And I can tell that because instead of the clay coming off in ribbons as it did in class, it's kind of coming off in chips. but it's not too dry that I can't still trim it. So you have kind of a range of clay consistency that you can trim within. Okay, so what I want to do right now is I want to trim the outside diameter. This is going to become my foot ring, and I want to trim that outside diameter until it's about 1/2 or 1/3 of the widest diameter. Err on the side of 1/2 because 1/3 can become kind of narrow. I want to do that first because if I start trimming on the inside and working my way out, then all of a sudden that diameter has become set. And notice that I'm using my trimming tool and already creating that foot. I'm not trimming it round right now. So now you can see where I've gotten into the clay a little bit more and it's a little softer. You can see how now it's coming off in ribbons. If it comes off in ribbons like that, then you're at a really good consistency to trim your vessel. If it's coming off in shavings, then it's gotten too dry. And honestly, if it's coming off in shavings, sometimes you have to make that decision. Is it better for me to continue to try to trim this, or do I spend my time making another bowl and doing better at catching it at the right consistency? Notice that I'm holding the tool with both of my hands. That provides a lot of stability. And I also have my arms anchored down on my legs. You want to use different sides of the tool depending on the job that you want to do. So there, I wanted to kind of smooth that line out, so I flipped it over and used the broader side of the tool. Okay, I can still go a little bit narrower. When you're trimming, you don't want to go super fast, but you also don't want to go really slow. This is a good speed. If your wheel's turning at this speed, you're just going way too slow, and the ability for you to press too hard and gouge out and make it uneven is much greater. Remember that inside contour. Okay, so this, by my eye, I can see it's probably about somewhere between 1/2 and 1/3 of this widest diameter here. Another way that you can determine that before you start trimming is to take a ruler and measure this distance. And then divide it in half or divide it into thirds, get your calipers out, and have your calipers set to whatever that number is. And then every time that you take some off, you can see if it is close to that ratio. Okay, now that I've gotten my outside diameter set, I want to go ahead and flatten the top off. Again, with the broad side of my large trimming tool. If you use your small trimming tool for this, it's really easy to catch an edge, so to speak, and really gouge your bottom. And then it's kind of like one of those, if you ever cut your own bangs, where you cut one side a little higher than the other, and then you try to fix it, and then you cut that side a little bit higher. The next thing you know, you don't have any bangs. Same thing for a foot. If you gouge it out, you're going to end up without a foot at all. And what the foot does is it provides a nice stable platform for your bowl to stand on. It's also an element of the design of the overall bowl and gives it a pedestal that provides the rest of the form to be elevated and gives it space to be looked at. Okay, now trimming the bowl, there's a lot of different ways that I am making a lot of different decisions here. Right now, I'm making a foot that is kind of vertical, right? It's very much, like 90 degrees to the wheelhead. That is because I'm looking at this edge here, and I'm mimicking that edge, right? So I'm using that element of repetition to make the choice here about what kind of foot I want to have on this. I could have had a foot that angled in, I could have had a foot that angled out, I could have one that's round, I could have one that's soft, I could have one that's a 1/2 inch tall, I could have one that's really short. Again, because of the different proportions that I have going on here, you know, this is a pretty bold statement, bold part of that bowl. And so I want to have enough of a foot so that it allows the bowl to rise up off the table, but not too much so that it captures the attention away from the rest of the vessel. So that is why I have chosen to have a very vertical outside foot contour, and also why I chose to have this height and not go down farther. Now I'm going to start removing clay from the center. This is where you want to switch to your small trimming tool. The very first thing that you want to do is you want to give yourself a nice, well-articulated ring in there, okay? That's the place that you stop. Because as you trim out the foot, you start in the middle and you work your way out. And if you don't have that, it's kind of like a barrier. A lot of times it's really easy for your tool to just go right off the edge, and then it's that bad haircut again, where you just keep taking clay off and off and off, and the next thing you know, you don't have a foot. If you make that little barrier there, you know where to stop, and your tool actually will also, you'll feel it, and you'll be able to stop a little bit better. So I usually bite in with kind of the corner of my the square side. Okay, if I use the round edge, then I'm not going to be stopping where I need to, because it actually will just carve that little groove right out. If I use the square edge of my tool, it will stop there. Again, you can see that my clay is a little bit on the stiff side, and so it's kind of makes that noise and it comes off in chunks. But I can still trim it. I just need to be a little bit more careful with how I use my tools here. Now the goal of the inside of the foot is to trim it down so that the inside of the foot ring meets the outside of the foot ring, where the clay hits that foot. It should look as if a ring was just dropped on a bowl that was trimmed perfectly even. Right now you can see that the inside clay here is much higher than it is on the outside. Now this is where it really is important to understand what that inside contour of your bowl looks like and feels like, and how thick it was when you began. Generally speaking, if I've trimmed this far on the outside of my foot ring, I'm good to go on the inside of that foot ring within maybe 2 millimeters. Unless I've made a really deep groove right in the center of my bowl, and that transition is not a smooth arc or curve on the interior. You don't want to leave those trimmings in there, because then you can't see what you're doing. Your foot ring, that's this part. Your foot ring should be appropriate to the size of the vessel. So this bowl is kind of large, and I want to have a foot ring that can support that. I wouldn't want a foot ring that is, you know, 3 millimeters in width, but I also don't want one that's a ½ inch in thick. It's more dangerous to have a foot that's too wide as opposed to having a foot that's too narrow. A foot that's too narrow is just going to be easier to end up trimming off by accident. A foot that's too wide is going to create a tension as the bowl dries. And as we recall, as the clay dries, it shrinks. And so if the bowl or the wall is thinner than a really wide foot, the wall of the bowl will dry quicker than the foot, and it will crack because it's shrinking quicker than the foot ring. That's why it's really important to have a foot ring that is appropriate in size and width to the bowl itself. My rule of thumb is try to make your foot ring as thick as the wall is. Now, how do you know if you've gone far enough? Well, again, the visual cues, okay? Does it look as if I was able to just kind of drop a foot ring onto the bowl? Does it make sense visually? Does the inside of the foot ring here match the outside of the foot ring? Generally speaking, understanding and remembering that the inside is curved. right? And so the outside of this foot ring may appear to be a little deeper than the inside. Now I want to move to my large trimming tool to get rid of the smaller trimming tool lines. That's an option. That's just because I don't like to see those small trimming tool lines because they're usually, for me, they're not very consistent. So this kind of erases those lines. Okay, so another way that you can try to see if the bowl is getting too thin is pushing down in the center and feeling. If it kind of caves or gives underneath that pressure, you're getting really close to having that bowl be too thin or that foot be too thin and actually trimming right through the bottom. And so there was a little bit of a give there, and so I'm gonna stop. Now I wanna take my wads off, dump off that dry clay because you're probably gonna be trimming a few bowls and you don't want your wads to take up too much of that dry clay and then become stiff themselves. Okay? So, right, foot ring works with this wall here. The interior of my bowl is pretty well reflected on the exterior of my bowl. My foot ring is a decent width, and by that I mean this dimension here. Okay? It's been trimmed to an appropriate depth. Okay? One of the last things that you want to be doing to your bowls is go ahead and do that little bit of refinement now, because if you wait to do it later or after it's been bisque fired, it's going to be too stiff. Well, it's going to be a different a different kind of consistency altogether, and you'll have to sand it, and sanding takes a lot more time than the amount of time that I have to invest right here. You also want to make sure that your foot ring is not sharp, so you want to take that sponge and just take off any of those hard edges there. So I'm going to do it one more time.